Hey friends, how do you know if you're being a truth seeker or if you're just being manipulated? Have you ever been absolutely convinced of something you saw online only to discover later that you were wrong? What if your desire to know the truth could actually make you easier to deceive? Have you ever seen an online story and thought, something feels off about this, but you couldn't really explain why? Well, in an age of AI, deepfakes, collapsing trusts in institutions, algorithms that are skewed a certain way, how do we as Christians tell the difference between healthy skepticism and destructive suspicion? What if seeing through deception requires more than just asking questions? And what if the most dangerous deception isn't believing a lie, but losing your ability to even know what is true? Well, today's episode is personal for me. I'm going to share a couple of personal stories of when I got swept up in one of these online theories years ago and the outcome of that. And then more recently, how one of my friends became implicated in one of these conspiracy theories. We're going to talk through all of that, plus establish some principles of critical thinking when we approach online narratives and even narratives in general and how we can think these things through. Now, the inspiration for this episode came to me a few weeks ago when I encountered a young man at a speaking event that I was at. He approached me, and I could immediately tell that this was a thoughtful young man, very smart, probably highly intelligent. He was polite. He was very intense. And it seemed to me right off the bat that he had been radicalized by something. Now, I didn't know what it was, but he was speaking in very general terms. He was saying things like, my generation wants this. My generation sees through this. My generation needs this to happen. And we don't trust this institution or that. And I remember thinking he's generalizing a whole generation of people, knowing that it's not a monolith. But what I discovered was that he had been most likely radicalized by the anti-Semitism that we're seeing so often on social media. And so I'm going to share a couple of those examples as we work through our principles today. But I remember asking him, he brought up Karl Marx, and he said something along the lines of Marx was Jewish, and his theory, Marxism, was actually created to give Jews world domination. Now, I had never heard that claim before I encountered this young man. So I was thinking, how am I going to respond to this? And so he made the claim that Karl Marx had written the theory for that purpose. And I just asked the young man, I said, okay, so did Karl Marx write somewhere in his writings that that was his motivation, that that was what he hoped to accomplish? And the young man thought for a moment. He said, well, no, but, and then he kept sort of stringing what could be unrelated events together to try to form this narrative about Karl Marx and the Jews. And we ended our conversation. Hopefully, I gave him some things to think about, but it got me thinking about conspiracy theories. And I want to talk to you about conspiracy theories because there's something that needs to be acknowledged right off the bat. And that is, number one, just because something sounds conspiratorial doesn't mean that it is unfounded or that it's a conspiracy theory as people use that term. Because some conspiracy theories actually turned out to be true. Watergate is a great example of this. Another one is that in COVID, we were told that we had to stand 6 feet apart. I mean, to the point that you would walk in a store or get in line to go into a store and there would be dots on the ground 6 feet apart and everybody would stand on their dot. And then later, of course, Fauci admitted that this was an arbitrary rule and it wasn't really based on data. So I think things like that have caused people to be more vulnerable to maybe unfounded conspiracy theories. And so I want to share now a personal story of when I got sucked into one of these theories. And this is back in 2012. Now, let me just give you some context about what was going on in my life in 2012. I had a toddler and I had a newborn baby. He was a few months old at this point. And this was right at the height of my faith crisis. I did not know what I believed about reality. I didn't know what I believed about God. And I remember seeing this Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting being reported on the news. Now, this happened on December 14th in 2012. And what happened was a 20-year-old man killed his mother in their home and then went to the school and opened fire. And he killed 20 kids, all between the ages of 6 and 7, and 6 adult staff members. And then when the police arrived, he killed himself. So the shooting became one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. It led to all kinds of national discussions and debates about school safety, mental health, gun policy, but it also became the subject of widespread conspiracy theories, and this is where my part comes in. I remember watching this story on the news, and immediately, before I saw anything else that anybody else was saying, something about this felt off. Something just didn't seem right about it. When I would watch interviews of people who were related to the events, they just weren't behaving in a way that I would expect somebody to behave had they just been through something like this. Then I began to see other people ask the same kinds of questions. I saw photoshopped family pictures that were very obviously photoshopped. I saw pictures of people who were supposedly killed who it seemed like maybe even didn't really exist. I saw other kinds of things like the fact that there was never any pictures of mortuary vehicles taking bodies away, or there was no, bodies coming out of the building. And I don't mean like graphic photos. Obviously, nobody wants to see that, but you would almost expect to see some kind of body bags coming out of the building or something like that. There was nothing like that. And everything about it just felt wrong. And I got really sucked into this, like very deeply. Now, I never said anything about this publicly because I held enough, I think, humility in my position that if I was wrong, I would not want to traumatize people who had really been through a horrific event. And I was actually quite shocked at how aggressive some people were online, where they would go and troll the families and they would say, oh, this never happened, you're in on it, that sort of thing. And there were Facebook pages that were formed. I didn't join those. I just held my suspicions kind of close to the chest. And I concluded that I just don't know. I don't know what happened. It didn't seem like everything was on the level. Now, I have always been a truth seeker, but at that time, I didn't have critical thinking skills. I really wanted to know the truth. In fact, I was so burdened by this because I wanted to know what was true, and things just didn't seem to be lining up. Now, I'm going to talk about some of those specific examples I just gave as we walk through the principles. So I'll leave that there. But I'll just say that I've since changed my mind about this as I learned critical thinking skills. But more recently, shortly after the murder of Charlie Kirk, a theory began to get a lot of traction online that even involved my friend, Frank Turek. Now, I've worked with Frank now for just about 10 years, and I've worked with him a lot and closely. And so it was really astonishing to see millions of interactions on posts that were initially framing him as the man in the white hat that was giving signals to the shooter, apparently. And so I made a video. I thought, oh, I can help clear this up. I know Frank. So I just made a video that said, hey, I know Frank. He's not part of any kind of conspiracy. This video to date is the most viewed video I've ever had on Instagram. It was over 2 million views and so many comments. Now, the thing that was interesting to me is that most of the comments were negative. Most of the comments were things like, Frank's guilty. Oh, great. Now we know who he is. So now we can look into his past. Oh, look, he has defended Israel in the past. Oh, that's obviously a connection. People were claiming that I was in on it. Some were even asking if I was AI. I mean, the whole thing was completely wild. So I know how these types of accusations, they weren't just accusations. They were actually people concluding things that wasn't based on evidence. And I know how these types of things can affect the lives of real people. So if you're wondering about some of these theories online, I just want to invite you into this episode. I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm not trying to put anybody down. My hope is that I can shed some light on these things and give you some things to consider, things that I have actually personally had to consider. So I've had increasing concerns about these things with the rise of people like Candace Owens, Alex Jones. And I want to just make sure that we as Christians check in with each other, that we're thinking critically, that we know what that means, and especially in the age of AI. Now, I want to take a little bit of a sidebar here. I've never publicly said how I use AI. I want to just basically go on public record about how I interact with AI. I do have ChatGPT on my phone. I've actually talked a little bit about this on the Unshaken Faith podcast with Natasha Crane. And I do use ChatGPT. Mostly that's the AI that I interact with, but I have some rules for myself that I will not cross. And I would just present these to you as things to consider. Maybe you could consider having the same rules for your life. I'll tell you one way AI has made my life and work so much more easy and has helped things flow so much more. And that is with writing podcast descriptions and YouTube descriptions. That used to take so much of my time. I would have to, because I record episodes and then time goes by and then I forget what I said. So then I have to go re-listen to the podcast, then write a description that will be something that will encompass all the material and say all the relevant points so that people know what it's about. I once put the entire transcript of a podcast into ChatGPT and I just said, write a podcast description. ChatGPT spit out 3 paragraphs that were great. And I read every word. I adjusted what I wanted to adjust. And so I will use AI for that purpose. But I will not, that's the only writing that I allow AI to do for me. I will not use ever AI to write an article. I will never ask AI to suggest wording for me if it's something for a book or an article. Only for YouTube and podcast descriptions. I have just found that that has increased my efficiency so much, and it does a pretty good job. I will never use AI for, at least as of now, this is where I'm at. I'm not going to use AI for imaging. First of all, I just find it cumbersome, takes so much time, never does a good job. So I don't use it for that. And let's talk a bit about something like a ChatGPT. I do use ChatGPT. I shared on X how I was trying to investigate the ideas of the early church fathers on hell. Like, what were they teaching on hell? And it was like a wild goose chase. It was hilarious. I posted it on X. Actually, Elon Musk retweeted it, which was insane. And that was like my most viewed tweet, which is kind of sad. I've put all this work into these other areas, and my most viewed piece of content to date is me whining about ChatGPT not being accurate. So, take that as you will. But what I will use ChatGPT for is kind of like a glorified Google. So I might put a question into Google just to see what pops up. But when I come to Google, I am not expecting that the first couple of things that Google spits out is going to be the definitive, authoritative answer for the question that I've asked. It's a starting point. I have to vet the source. I have to make sure that the articles that are popping up or the references that it's giving me are good ones, are ones that are backed in reality by truth and by good research and by credibility, those sorts of things. And so I have found that with ChatGPT, it can kind of give me sometimes a better starting point than Google can, but I don't assume that anything that ChatGPT is saying is true, and I will never use the answers it gives me without absolutely double, triple checking the citations. And that's what I learned on the Church Fathers quote. In fact, I want to read this to you. Okay, this is my conversation with ChatGPT. Me. Give me a couple of quotations from early church fathers about the doctrine of hell with reference. ChatGPT. Here's a quote from Ignatius. Gives quote and reference. Me. Checks reference. It's not there. That isn't the right reference. ChatGPT. Oh, you're right. My mistake. Here's the correct reference. Me. Checks reference. It's not there either. ChatGPT. Good catch. It's actually not in that writing at all. It's actually here. Gives third reference. Me. Checks third reference. Not there. This is a direct quote. ChatGPT, yes, I understand your frustration. Psychoanalyzes me as being frustrated because of that, I am now frustrated. Me, wastes an hour of my life trying to find the quote because it was really good. I can't find the quote anywhere. You're sure this was an actual direct quote from Ignatius? ChatGPT, good catch, my mistake. This is not an Ignatius quote. Me, who said it? ChatGPT. Actually, that quote is not found in any of the church fathers. Me, where did it come from? ChatGPT. I was summarizing the popular understanding of Ignatius on the doctrine of hell. If you would like me to be more precise in the future, just say things like facts only. Me, why do you just say stuff that's not based on fact? ChatGPT. I don't intentionally make things up, but I can generate statements that sound confident even when they're not fully correct, oversimplified, or based on incomplete information. And then I wrote, I am persuaded that ChatGPT is programmed to be a pathological liar. And when you confront that, it is programmed to gaslight you. Prove me wrong. So that tweet got 4.4 million interactions, which is crazy to me. But at any rate, that's kind of how I approach ChatGPT and AI in general. I will use it, but I use it like Google, really carefully, and I make sure that everything it's saying is true, and I have to go search those references because it will actually give false quotes. Okay, if you want to know more or there's something I didn't cover about the way I approach AI, please leave a comment or a question about it, and I'll try to answer it in a future podcast. Okay, now I want to go to some common hallmarks of conspiracy theories. The first one is called unfalsifiability, and that's where evidence against the theory is treated as proof that the conspiracy is true or that it's hiding itself. This way, the theory becomes nearly impossible to disprove. And so if I were to mention a name of somebody who does this, it would be somebody like Candace Owens. I know that by me mentioning her name, if any of her followers hear this, they will assume that I am part of the problem or that I'm part of the conspiracy because I'm addressing this. And this has actually happened. So when I've critiqued Candace in the past, her followers leave comments saying that I'm, for example, being paid by Israel or that I'm a part of it. And this is also what happened with my video where I was trying to explain who Frank Turek was, is people were just assuming that because I was speaking to it, that that's evidence that I'm actually a part of it. So there's almost this sense in which you can't prove it wrong because the more evidence you bring against it, the more it's assumed that you're part of it and that you're just defending. And so that's what we call unfalsifiability. The second principle that's often a part of these conspiracy theories is what you might call assumption of coordinated secret intent. So this is when random events, like maybe somebody's incompetence or ordinary things that somebody might be motivated by, like ordinary incentives, these are reframed as a part of a deliberate hidden plan by these powerful actors that are controlling things. So here's an example. In the past several years, many people have started working from home, right? I think this is something that happened because of COVID. We saw that companies realized that people work really well from home. We now have the technology to do that. And in many cases, it has stayed that way. I mean, there are many of you listening to this podcast now that started working from home during COVID, and you're still doing that. And so there's ordinary incentives for that. The regular explanation would be, hey, this saves companies a lot of money in overhead. They don't have to pay for an office space. They don't have to pay for wasted time. But, we have technology that makes this possible and makes it easier. These are incentives that are very easy to understand. But when a conspiratorial thing sort of takes hold, these incentives are dismissed. And they're kind of brushed off. And instead, the assumption is that, there's bad actors that are conspiring to make it this way. All these tech people got together to try to get people to work from home so they could make more money. And, I want to say, is that possible? Sure. Is it plausible? Sure. But there's not evidence for that. And you're probably going to hear me hit on that point a lot during this podcast, is that just because something is plausible doesn't mean there's evidence to say that it actually is what happened. There's a lot of things that are plausible. So it's really just based on an assumption. So that's something to really keep watch on, is assumption of a coordinated event that's being kept secret. The third one is selective evidence. So small anomalies, like things like coincidences, these will be magnified. They will be emphasized heavily, while any evidence that's brought to contradict that is ignored, brushed off, dismissed, and even sometimes characterized as manipulation. So I want to give you an example of this one. So Candace Owens has made a lot of claims about Erica Kirk. She highlights isolated details. Here are some of the details she isolated. Erica Kirk laughing during an internal staff call that happened shortly after Charlie was killed. Discussing, she has Erica discussing metrics, discussing merchandise, how many hats they've sold, I think was one of them. And Candace treated those things as suspicious evidence of hidden motives, right? So she's like, oh, well, Erica's laughing. She's talking about merch. So there has to be some kind of hidden motive. This isn't lining up. And Candace would downplay also alternative explanations, because there are a lot of alternative explanations for that. Number one, anybody who's encountered a sudden death, and I can't speak to something that's, well, I guess I can. I've encountered both. I've encountered the sudden death of my nephew and the expected death of my father. Both were very different realities and experiences. But in both cases, there was a lot of laughter. In fact, I remember after my nephew died, within 2 or 3 days, there was one moment where, I'm glad nobody had this on recording, because we would have all just looked insane. We were laughing so hysterically. And it was grief playing itself out in a weird way. Grief comes in waves. I've said this before on the podcast. After my dad died, we were at the funeral home and we were just laughing hysterically at this one point. And I was a little embarrassed about that. And I asked the funeral director, is this normal? Like, do people do this? And the funeral director said, yes, in this room, people either laugh, cry, or fight. And so, those kind of emotions are actually quite common in grief. And also talking about merch and metrics and things like that, we have to bear in mind that Erica was now suddenly running an organization. So it would be her natural disposition in that context to want to reassure employees. Also, these isolated clips happened within the context of larger conversations. And also, grief looks different on everybody. So there are alternate explanations, is my point. So selective evidence isn't necessarily cumulative evidence of a particular conclusion. So we need to keep that in mind. The fourth one, and this is something that Candace does a lot, is expanding the scope. So making big claims, and then as those claims fail, the conspiracy grows to include more institutions like the media. It's now the scientists, it's all the courts, it's universities, it's all the whistleblowers. Entire governments are involved in this. And this is something I saw when I watched Candace's whole series on Brigitte Macron. So her initial claim was that Brigitte Macron is secretly a man, right? That it's a trans person that went from male to female. And when there really isn't direct evidence to show that, she would broaden the scope. Oh, the media is covering it up. Then it expanded even broader to the French government is protecting this lie. Then when the Macrons actually filed a lawsuit against Candace, then that lawsuit itself became proof that powerful institutions are trying to silence independent voices. It's almost like every piece of evidence against just put gas in the tank. Now, in regards to the Charlie Kirk murder, I remember encountering this. If you suggested, hey, law enforcement is investigating this, there's going to be a trial, there's going to be evidence presented as a trial. Maybe they're not letting us know all of the evidence right now because they need to save things for trial. All of those claims were, because this happened to me when I would say things like that. Those things were dismissed and viewed as further evidence that there's this big cover-up happening. Oh, we can't trust law enforcement. Oh, you're such a simpleton for saying such a thing. Law enforcement's in on it, that sort of thing. So with the way that these are set up, there's just almost in the mind of the way that this machine runs, there's no way to disprove it with evidence because someone is so sure because of these different principles. We're going to get to some more principles in a moment, but what a perfect time to talk about our first sponsor, which is Foundation Worldview. In this culture, even the youngest of our kids are presented with thousands of competing truth claims every week, just as we are online. And it can be very difficult for us as adults to sort these things through. This is why I love the curriculums that are on the Foundation Worldview curriculum site. One of the ones we did in our home was called Biblical Worldview Curriculum, and they really teach kids, and you'll learn too as you go through this with your kids, basic questions like, what is truth? Who is God? How did life begin? What does it mean to be human? How can I tell right from wrong? And what I love about these curriculums is they can be easily implemented in your home, church, or Christian school. They have so many different ones on critical thinking, world religions, biblical sexuality. They've done a great job on that topic. So check them out today and go to foundationworldview.com, and you can use my code Alisa for 10% off any family, church, or Christian school license. Again, that's foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa. All right, the next principle of some of these conspiracy theories that we're going to talk about is, this is a big one. We're going to camp here for a minute, and that is reliance on hidden knowledge. So believers in the theory are basically told that they possess this kind of secret knowledge. It's like, we're going to tell you what they don't want you to know. And this creates like an insider-outsider dynamic. Like the people that don't get it, they just don't get it. We know. We have this kind of secret knowledge. And this type of an ideology has a very long history, particularly within Christianity. And that is through the heresy of Gnosticism. I've talked a little bit about Gnosticism on this podcast before, but I want to dive a little deeper because I really think that we're seeing this Gnostic heresy just sort of reinvent itself and take on different forms, maybe put on different costumes. But it's this idea that there's this hidden knowledge, that if you just access this hidden knowledge, that's what's really going to make you enlightened or saved. So in the 5th century, Augustine, I love St. Augustine, I love his book, Confessions, and he was famously refuting a group called the Manichaeans. Now, this is not necessarily a Gnostic sect, but they shared some similarities with Gnosticism, and he was a part of this group before his conversion to Christianity. And so the Manichaeans saw the world as a fight between the spiritual world of light and the material world of darkness. So the spiritual world was good and the physical world was dark and bad. So this, along with a focus of what we might articulate today in our self-help culture as finding yourself, right? This was kind of a common theme among all different types of Gnostics. And I should say off the bat that Gnosticism isn't all just one thing. It's sort of a broad term, and there were different sects within Gnosticism that had different views on things. But if you could characterize them, like what did they have in common? They articulated a gospel that was much different than what we find in Scripture. So the church father Irenaeus wrote a really amazing book that everybody should read. It's called Against Heresies. It is a fascinating read. And he wrote this around AD 180, and he was addressing some Gnostic ideas that were coming into the church at that time. Now, it's kind of weird. It's actually very hard to understand. I read Against Heresies where he's characterizing these different Gnostic sects, and it's weird. It's fascinating. There's a lot of different expressions of Gnosticism, as you'll learn. So it can be hard to kind of find the common theme. But all the strangeness aside, there is a practical element to Gnosticism that really resonates with a lot of modern people. In fact, I've shared that when I was in a church that was on its way to becoming a progressive Christian church, a lot of people were very fascinated with the Gnostic Gospels. They were fascinated with Gnosticism. And so that word Gnostic comes from gnosis, which just means knowledge. So Gnosticism, the gospel of Gnosticism, wasn't about sin and redemption. In fact, Gnostics didn't even believe that the world was broken because of Adam's choice to sin against God. They believe it was corrupted because of this evil demiurge who created it and rules over it. And the only kind of sin it addresses is ignorance. So what's wrong with the world according to the Christian worldview is sin. What's wrong with the world according to the Gnostic worldview is ignorance. So Gnostics believed that Jesus came not to save us from sin, but to impart this special, secret, hidden knowledge that would essentially lead us to participate in the divine pleroma. And so to find this knowledge was actually to find salvation. Now, Francis T. Fallon wrote a journal article called The Gnostics, the Undominated Race. And he wrote this is a quote. He said, "The freedom of the Gnostic is freedom from subjection to the heavenly ruler, the evil demiurge. This freedom is attained by him, this freedom is attained by him by participation in the divine realm, the pleroma." So early Gnostics had to popularize the ideas that they were bringing in among Christians by claiming to be Christians themselves. And they used scripture alongside their own texts to prove their ideas. So Irenaeus talked about this. He explained that they not only used the writings of the New Testament to demonstrate their what he called perverse interpretations and deceitful expositions, but they also interpreted parables and allegories from the Old Testament in a duplicitous and fraudulent manner, as he said. So they would flip the meaning. So in his section of Against Heresies, where Irenaeus is explaining how they interpret the Bible, he wrote this. Let me find the quote here. This is a quote. He said, "And it is not only from the writings of the evangelists and the apostles that they endeavor to derive proofs for their opinions by means of perverse interpretations and deceitful expositions. They deal in the same way with the law and the prophets, which contain many parables and allegories that can frequently be drawn into various senses, according to the kinds of exegesis to which they are subjected. And others of them, with great craftiness, adapted such parts of Scripture to their own figments, lead away captive from the truth those who do not retain a steadfast faith in one God, the Father Almighty, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God." So I want to give you an example of this. There's a Gnostic text called Exegesis on the Soul, and it appeals to the book of Hosea. Now, in Hosea, God tells Hosea to marry Gomer, a woman who will be unfaithful. So they have children, and God gives them symbolic names that basically pronounce judgment on Israel. Now, Gomer leaves Hosea, pursues other lovers. Her unfaithfulness becomes a picture of Israel abandoning God through idolatry and breaking of their covenants. So instead of permanently rejecting her, though, Hosea later redeems and restores Gomer, buying her back and bringing her home. And this becomes a picture of God's covenant love. It's Israel deserves judgment, but God still seeks restoration rather than abandoning her. So in the original meaning of Hosea, the woman, now this is a real story, this is real history, but the meaning is that the woman represents Israel, and the adultery that she commits is idolatry of Israel, the covenant unfaithfulness. And then the restoration that happens is God restoring Israel. But the Gnostic reinterpretation of this, according to that Gnostic text, Exegesis on the Soul, it's that the woman becomes in the individual soul. That's really who she is. She represents the individual soul. And her adultery becomes the soul's descent into material corruption. Remember that kind of difference between the spiritual world of light and the material world of darkness. So when she commits adultery, that's the soul's descent into being corrupted by the material world. And then restoration is the soul receiving, guess what? Gnosis, knowledge, which reunites her to her heavenly bridegroom, to be one with that divine pleroma. So in the introduction to Irenaeus' Against Heresies, John Orensden, I think that's how it said, he wrote this: "When Gnosticism came in touch with Christianity, which must have happened almost immediately on its appearance, Gnosticism threw herself with strange rapidity into Christian forms of thought, borrowed its nomenclature, acknowledged Jesus as Savior of the world, simulated its sacraments, pretended to be an esoteric revelation of Christ and his apostles, flooded the world with apocryphal gospel and acts and apocalypses to substantiate its claim. So Gnostics actually viewed themselves as being much more enlightened than the simpletons, the simple folks, the closed-minded people, the simple-minded people who believed that Jesus died to atone for their sins. Instead, they saw him as making right a corrupted cosmos that the evil demiurge created. With that, I want to take us to our next sponsor, and that's 7 Weeks Coffee. I had my 7 Weeks Coffee this morning. It is so, so good. It is shade-grown, low-acid, mold-free, organically farmed. It's obtained through direct trade, which is more ethical than fair trade. And if you've been listening for a while, you know that 7 Weeks Coffee isn't just a sponsor for us. It is actually a company that we really believe in because of their pro-life ethic. They are America's pro-life coffee company. They're on a mission to fund the pro-life movement, one cup of coffee at a time. They call their name 7 Weeks because at 7 weeks of gestation, the baby is the size of a coffee bean, and that's when you can first detect a heartbeat on the ultrasound. This is why they give 10% of every sale to pregnancy resource centers and pro-life organizations all across the nation, raising over $1 million, saving thousands of lives. I want you to try 7 Weeks Coffee. Go to 7weekscoffee.com today, and you're going to save 15% forever if you subscribe to, I think they still call it the Heartbeat Club. Plus, you'll get a free gift with that order. But if you also use the code Alisa, you'll get an additional 10% off your first order. So that's 25% total savings on your first order plus that free gift. So go to 7weekscoffee.com today and use my code Alisa at checkout. All right, let's go to this next one, which is number 6, pattern seeking from unrelated events. So this is where separate events are connected into like a single narrative without strong causal evidence that they're connected. So this is where I'm going to share about the Sandy Hook situation. So I mentioned that I started to see some things that looked suspicious. They didn't feel right. The first thing was that I went and saw that the Facebook page for the memorial was created the day before the shooting. And so as I learned critical thinking skills, I started to ask myself, are there any alternative explanations for this? And one of the things was that, yes, I mean, in theory, it's fishy, right? But in theory, that could have been a page that was created the day before. And then when the event happened, somebody thought, oh, I started this page. We'll just change the name and we can make it for this. That's plausible. That's possible. That's an alternate explanation. The Facebook page being created the day before doesn't necessarily mean that the whole thing was a sham, right? This is where we don't want to just take unrelated events and make them together a cause. And another explanation could be a glitch. Another explanation could be conflicting time zones. Maybe somebody made it in another part of the world. And things like this can happen. That wouldn't be enough on its own. But there was more. The fact there were no body bags that came out of the building. I mean, this is puzzling, right? Because in so many other types of situations like this, you see things like that. There are alternate explanations for this. There could be that just because of the nature of it being such young children, maybe there was a general kind of public respect for not wanting to photograph that. There's also, I've looked into this, when something like this happens, there are areas that are cordoned off for news outlets to be allowed access to. So they may not have even had access to where that might have been happening, for example. There are alternate explanations. The photoshopped images is pretty simple to explain. I remember being in music and we would do photo shoots and there would be a picture where two of us looked great and one of us just looked crazy. And so the one who looked crazy would say, well, I really like this picture of myself better. And they would Photoshop the one we liked onto the one that looked great of the other two. It happened all the time. And this happens in family photos as well. And back then, Photoshop wasn't as good, obviously, as we can do now. It's almost imperceptible now with AI and all these things. And so it was noticeable maybe that there was some photoshopping done on a family picture. That's not that hard to explain. The fact that people were acting weird, I mean, this is probably something that I feel the most humbled by and have to repent for, because how do I know how somebody's going to respond when they go through something that traumatic and that harrowing and awful? And as I began, and what I realized too is back in 2012, when I was kind of believing this, I refused really to meaningfully engage evidence that would prove what I thought was happening wrong. I'm not saying everybody does that, but since that time, I've watched interviews of some of the survivors. And my husband, for example, when he was touring with a country artist, visited that town and talked with the actual people who had lost children. And so what's the better explanation? That all of these people, including these survivors, have just kept this story going for what? For what purpose? And our amazing actors, I watched just this morning an interview with some of the survivors as they were graduating high school. Like, these kids would have to be the best actors in the world. And they were giving details of their experience of that day. So what is the best explanation is that it happened and that law enforcement has access to more information than I do, and that I got caught up into something that wasn't true. And I think I realized that a while ago, but especially when this new conspiracy theory involving Frank started getting traction, realizing like, man, this stuff is really contagious and smart people can fall for this. And I think especially, I'm going to give some reasons in a minute why I think people are vulnerable to this, but I'm going to give you a few more principles first. So number 7 is that suspicion outweighs evidence. This is like an emotional appeal. And this is what got me. So like something feels off. There's too many coincidences. The official story doesn't add up, but there's not really solid proof or evidence saying otherwise. And the one thing we have to bear in mind is when there are investigations into these things, the FBI, law enforcement, they don't release all the evidence to the public. They save a lot of that evidence for trial. So there's a lot we don't know. And so when we only appeal to something feels off, there's too many coincidences, I think it's fine to say, hey, I'm going to just hold off on deciding what I think about this until I look at all the evidence, after the court comes out and all of that. But instead of, saying I have evidence, it's saying I have a feeling. And that's a very dangerous place to be in. And a lot of it relies on insinuation, which here's an example of insinuation. If you were to say to somebody, hey, I have evidence that you're cheating on your wife. I hired a private investigator and they have conclusively proven with photographic evidence you're cheating on your wife. That's a truth claim that is based on evidence. What insinuation sounds like is you might say, I just find it interesting that on Wednesdays you leave work early and come home a little late. Just asking questions. But there are a lot of alternate explanations to why somebody might be leaving on Wednesdays early and coming home a little late. Maybe they're taking a dance class. Maybe that's the day they work out. Or maybe they are doing something secret that's not cheating on their wife. Maybe it's something else. So we need evidence for claims, not just insinuation and not just a feeling. So good questions to ask when you're encountering some theories like this. What are the alternate explanations for what people are saying? Are there alternate explanations? Do we need more information? That's a great question to ask. What is the reason I should conclude, in this case that I just gave, that there is infidelity? Is there something else that could explain this? These are good critical thinking questions to ask when it comes to insinuation and those emotional appeals. All right, number 8 is moving goalposts. This is something that Candace does a lot. So when predictions fail, like there's these grand predictions, this is going to happen. We have a big thing coming out next episode, and then it doesn't happen. That date passes. The documents that were promised don't appear. But then the theory just adapts instead of collapsing. It's really, that was one of my main takeaways when I watched Candace's whole thing on Brigitte Macron, is that she would make these big promises and then the next episode would come and go and she didn't deliver on those, but she would just introduce something new. So the theory would just adapt. Instead of people saying, hey, you've never brought what you said you were going to bring, it doesn't collapse. It just grows. Well, now I'm distracted by this claim. So let's apply this to Candace's accusations against Erica Kirk. So somewhere when she started kind of looking at Erica, it was almost as if she was saying there's certain things around Erica's behavior, certain timing issues, decisions. These seem kind of suspicious and we just need an explanation. But then when those explanations were given, like specific questions received specific responses from TPUSA leadership, there were explanations for the leaked audio. Erica responded publicly. She even met with Candace. Then the focus shifts to new things. That's when she started focusing on the laughter on the calls, merch discussions, family history, broader TPUSA relationships. And so rather than the suspicion, those initial claims being resolved, it just grows and grows and grows. So the next principle would be heavy use of anecdotal or anonymous sourcing. This is something Candace does a lot. Unnamed insiders, sources close to, screenshots that aren't given context, clipped videos, isolated testimony that doesn't have corroboration from anyone else. So there's a heavy use of that. Anecdotal, anecdotes can be valuable in certain contexts, but they're not eyewitness testimony. They're not like actual evidence for a claim. And the final one is moral simplification. So things that are very complex are reduced to just a battle of good versus evil. This is truth tellers versus evil manipulators, and you're one or the other. And then when somebody tries to explain some complexities, they're seen with suspicion. Oh, what are you hiding? That sort of thing. So the difference between I mentioned, Watergate, for example, real conspiracies eventually get strong verifiable evidence. There's documents, there's financial trails, there's recordings, there's multiple independent witnesses, there's court findings, there's people admitting things, there's investigative reporting from unrelated sources, right? So a claim isn't automatically true or false just because it sounds conspiratorial. The key question is whether evidence is presented that's independently verifiable and whether that evidence is proportionate to the size of the claim. And with that, I'll go to our final sponsor for today, and that is Good Ranchers. Guys, I am so thankful for Good Ranchers, American meat delivered right to your door every month. It makes my meal planning so easy. Just 2 days ago, I just thought, I don't know what to make for dinner. I don't have much because it's time to go to the grocery store, but I did have some tortillas, and I had some barbecue sauce, some taco seasoning, and of course, my steaks from Good Ranchers. And I didn't want to have to do a big cook thing at night. So in the morning, I just threw a bunch of steaks in the slow cooker with some taco seasoning, just let them go all day on low. And then I shredded them and put some barbecue sauce. You guys, I'm not kidding. My family was like, this is like one of the greatest things we've had in such a long time. And I just put them in the tortillas with some cheese, and they were like the most amazing quesadillas we have ever had. And they're already asking for me to make those again. And all of that was possible because I just have that Good Ranchers grass-fed beef ready to go right in my freezer. If you've never tried Good Ranchers, start your plan today and you're going to get free meat included with every order plus $100 off your first 3 orders with my code Alisa. So just go to goodranchers.com, use the code Alisa at checkout. Again, that's free meat with every order and $100 off your first 3 orders when you start that subscription plan. And that's only good this month. So if you want to just try it out though, don't necessarily want to subscribe, you can get $40 off your first order with my code Alisa instead. So go to goodranchers.com today, American meat delivered. All right. So I mentioned that I was going to close out with some reasons I think people are vulnerable for these conspiracy theories. The first one is information overload. One of the hallmarks of conspiracy theories is that they throw so much information at you, there's no way that you can possibly get through all of it. And when you just focus on one claim, by the time you do that, there's 10 more claims being made. And so that information overload, just that constant barrage of information is overwhelming. And people are exposed to nonstop information. And when you combine that with collapsing trust in institutions, right? A lot of trust has declined for the government, for media. Hi, I'm one of them. I don't trust the general media hardly at all. Academia, hi, that's me. I'm starting to tell people, if you don't have to go to college, don't go, because it seems to me like so many of our colleges are just Marxist indoctrination camps. And so I get it. I get that trust in institutions has declined. Declining trust in public health agencies, corporations, you name it. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. But when trust drops, that's when these alternative explanations become more attractive. Then you combine with that the algorithms. So social media rewards outrage, novel ideas. They reward certainty and emotionally charged narratives. Guys, my podcast could be a lot more popular if I would capitalize on this stuff. I know that. I know that there are topics that I will talk about that I could make go nuclear if I capitalized on outrage, novelty, certainty, and emotionally charged narratives. You look at how huge people are out there that do that. But as a Christian and wanting to have biblical integrity, I try not to do that. I want to present the information in the best way possible. I want as many people as possible to click on the information, but I have to watch that because everybody does, because you can be a lot more popular than you are if you capitalize on these things. That's what the algorithm rewards. And conspiracy content performs so well because it's all of those things. It's dramatic, it's simplified, it's highly shareable. So when you have real institutional failures, financial crises, corporate corruption, all of this kind of changing public health guidance, political scandals, all of that combines. Also, there's a decline of gatekeepers. So historically, people like editors, publishers, there were broadcast standards within news organizations that filtered information before it had any kind of mass distribution. But now anyone can just instantly publish to millions of people whatever they think. There's also a sense of identity and belonging. I think People are vulnerable because for many people, belief systems like this become tied to a community identity. So if you reject the theory, it almost can feel like you're rejecting the group itself. So that identity piece becomes very important, almost like we would call it tribalism. Another reason I think people are vulnerable is AI and synthetic media. I have known many people in my personal life that have fallen for AI. I see it all the time on social media where a post is obviously like an AI picture with some sob story about it, and they're sharing it because they don't realize it's been created by AI. We are all vulnerable to this, and AI is getting better and better to the point where I don't even believe what I see anymore. I have a lot of questions I have to ask when a claim is made, even alongside a video. We have deepfakes, edited clips, fake screenshots. People do that all the time, where they'll fake screenshot something somebody supposedly said, and you do a little investigation, and apparently they never said it. AI-generated content makes things so much harder to figure out what is actually authentic. And so this increases a general instability in people to even be able to know what is real. And so people become increasingly unsure what is real. There's another one that has to do with, I sort of hinted at this, but complexity fatigue. So modern systems like geopolitics, finance, biotechnology, intelligence operations, investigations, all these things are quite complex. And people feel fatigued by all the complexity. And TikTok, you can do a 20-second video and it's very simple and there's outrage and there's like, hey, I'm going to tell you this secret knowledge you didn't know before. And it's 20-second long. And then people feel emotionally satisfied with that because reality is a lot more complicated. Reality is actually quite a bit more messy than that. So that's about all I have to say on that today. I think my ending charge is let's be good thinkers as Christians. Let's not jump on every bandwagon. Let's give ourselves some time to ask good questions. Is there an alternate explanation for this? Is there evidence to prove the claim that's being made? What is that evidence? Let me take a look at that. And I also just want to encourage you that you don't have to engage with everything. There is so much out there. Oh my goodness. If I tried to stay on top of the news cycle on X or on this podcast, I would be an exhausted person. I would be a bad wife and a bad mom. So deal with what you can. Maybe deal with the things that are most affecting your personal life. Maybe a loved one that's swept up into something. Maybe you're confused yourself about something. I want to encourage you to ask good questions, give yourself permission to step back from social media if you need to, because I ultimately think so much of this is a distraction. And here's a really great question to ask yourself when it comes to any kind of alternative narrative that's being presented online. Ask yourself, does even getting into this lead me closer to the Lord? Does it edify me spiritually? Is this something that is going to encourage me to spend more time in the Word of God, or is it going to distract me from the Word of God? Is this something that is going to encourage me to be united more with my believers around the things we're supposed to be united around, the gospel, right? We're supposed to, as brothers and sisters in Christ, be united around the gospel, not fighting over what Erica Kirk did with her eyes. Those are good questions to ask. Is this something that is a valuable use of my time, even? And if you determine that it is, then do it with integrity, do it with excellence, do it with good critical thinking, and be a truth seeker. And I mentioned at the beginning that sometimes being a truth seeker can make you more vulnerable to deception. And I think that was illustrated in the case of me getting swept up into the Sandy Hook thing so many years ago. I genuinely wanted truth. And something felt so off about it that out of a love for truth, I was trying to figure it out. And I know that people who get swept up into these things are not all bad people who are just wanting to, tear something down. I think a lot of times people are genuinely seeking truth. So I want to encourage us to seek truth. Jesus is the truth. And he said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And God is a God of love. He's a God of truth. And we as Christians should be the people that are pursuing truth more than anybody. So with that, let's remember that as we pursue Christ, let's keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.